evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are in our 29th year here at the Writer's Block, I interview writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished, what they're planning for the future. Sometimes the writers are poets, sometimes novelists, historians, journalists, all kinds of writers. And in fact, we've had on other kinds of artists. We've had on sculptors, musicians, actors. It's a very broad net. So if you have an idea for a guest who might be a good idea for the Writer's Block, watch for our address at the end of the show. We'd love to get your suggestions. I'd also like to add that this production of 1623 Studios and all the other programs that come out of this studio project for and about Cape Ann, all of that's a result of cable access television. So don't be suckered in by those dish ads. You stick with cable, stick with the Writer's Block. Tonight, I'm happy to say we do have a writer, a very accomplished local historian who's returning now with his 5th book on local lore. His name is Chet Brigham. I'm going to read his profile as part of my introduction and then mention the other book, or as part of that, mention the other books that he has has written and that we've talked about here on the Writer's Block. Each of Chet Brigham's 5 books of nonfiction begin in Gloucester, Massachusetts. He starts with an individual or an event, then pursues the significant links wherever they lead. That is often far from Cape Ann. He takes readers to the Arctic in the 20s and 30s in the company of legendary Captain Bob Bartlett, to packet ship voyages shuttling between the Cape Verde Islands and New England, to the lower Manhattan and East Gloucester with the artistry of John Sloan, and to the England of T.S. Eliot with his nostalgia for a boyhood of sailing seaplanes, sailing out of Gloucester, I jumped a line, for sailing out of Gloucester Harbor to islands down east, and then to the sputtering wood and fabric Coast Guard seaplanes winging low along Atlantic shores in the pursuit of prohibition rum runners. Those previous books were titled The Phoenix of the Seas, On Opposite Tacks, Gloucester's Bargain with the Sea, and The Stream I Go A-Fishing In. Chet Brigham, welcome back to the Writer's Block.
Happy to be here.
I'm very happy to plug this book. It's a very, very interesting book. 10 Pound Island, a little 3.5-acre island in Gloucester's outer harbor that has had a much more exciting history than you would suspect by looking at it right now. I mentioned before the show I was very struck with one picture taken in the 20s, an aerial shot, and it looks like a little village. There's a fish hatchery, there's the Lighthouse with a family living there, and there's who would have thought it, an airport. Tell us about 10 Pound Island, its exciting history, and how that dinky little island ever got an airport.
Well, you're right, George. It's just 3.5 acres, and by then in 1927, it did occupy all of these facilities, and each one had a fairly colorful story. One, the Lighthouse, that story began with a low-price bid for the construction, which the government finally got around to doing in 1820. And what they put up was not very satisfactory. In fact, one of the early lighthouse keepers complained about the rot, and he had to stuff the windows, and the lighthouse array of candles, only a few of them were functional. And that eventually was replaced with good lenses.
The Fresnel lenses?
Yeah, finally a Fresnel lens in the 1880s. which really solved the problem. It was only a fifth level Fresnel because they didn't have to reach that far in the harbor. The Eastern Point Lighthouse that had a four level Fresnel, and the Thatcher's Island had a first level, and of course that famous one is now in the Cape Ann Museum with its own niche. But the fish hatchery that came up about in 1889, and the idea was of the government was to restock the local harbors with cod and halibut fry, and with the hopes that they could keep the local fishery going, so that not so many boats would have to go out to the banks for them. So that lasted for some time. As a matter of fact, there were finally 1 billion eggs collected in 1927, until the government finally gave that up. But the big thing was the air station, and that came about as a result of Prohibition, because in Prohibition days, the Rum Row extended up to off Cape Ann, and the rum running into the coves and harbors and beaches of Gloucester and Rockport and Essex was on a grand scale.
When I first started this book, I thought there were going to be a couple isolated incidents that were spectacularly interesting, but just isolated. But it was constant.
It was, and as a matter of fact, in Bayview at Plum Cove Beach, the summer residents all complained that night after night that their slumbers were disturbed by landings. And even Howard Blackburn got involved because his saloon, which he supposedly converted into a soda shop during Prohibition, it was noticed that a lot of the fellows going in there didn't look like Moxie drinking types. And revenuers came in, and sure enough, there was a certain supply available for his old customers. So he was tried, but the case was thrown out because of the popular. Howard Blackburn was a local saint at the time, not only from his survival skills and sailing lone-handed across the Atlantic, but he was very generous to his fellow fishermen that had in
Did they actually sell some soda from his old tavern?
I don't know if he had any of that on it or not.
I wanted to mention, if I interrupt you for a second, the book has 10 Pound Island, where the Coast Guard earned its wings, has a lot of really nice black and white pictures. And this is the aerial shot that I described as looking kind of like a village. You can see it's difficult to see here, but the fisheries here and the air station here, and then the lighthouse up here. And then here's one of the, on the other side, one of the early planes. And there are many, many really nice black and white pictures. Another one I'm going to show a little bit later. Now, I'm sorry I interrupted because I wanted to point that picture out. You're talking about the rum running, and Howard Blackburn being involved in it.
Yeah, and the law enforcement was a little haphazard, shall we say, because a lot of people weren't that thrilled about the whole idea of Prohibition in Gloucester. And as one local historian said, it was never much of a temperance town, and it was less so by then.
Excuse me, when you mentioned law enforcement, I might as well show this now. There is a picture in the text of and it doesn't show up real well, but there's a motorcycle officer, Gloucester cop, and he has not been identified. Have you, since the publication of the book, been able to identify him, or has anybody come forward?
No, he remains anonymous.
Still
Anonymous law
anonymous. So
enforcement.
if anybody gets the book and you happen to recognize this picture from old family albums and can identify, Chet and I would like to know who that gentleman is.
And whether or not he might have been on the take as well.
He looks sober in that picture. So
but
the suppression of prohibition wasn't going too well.
Not too well. And the police chief, then known as the Marshal, was so frustrated that he decided on a stratagem that was unusual, to say the least. He dressed up as a flapper and applied lipstick and rouge and went out and infiltrated bootleg circles in attempts to get evidence. And that sounds like an impossible story, but there was a photo in the Globe, which I couldn't obtain for it's such poor quality, I couldn't put it in the book. But it shows him as a flapper with one of his lieutenants on either side, hamming it up as being cozy. But whether or not that worked, the Coast Guard decided that they really had to intervene, and they set up a cutter station in Gloucester, particularly for the purpose of chasing rum runners and Rum Row boats. And the commander of that was a young Lieutenant Commander C.C. von Paulson, who was quite effective, and he had eventually 17 rum-running boats that he could dispatch. But even so, only 1 in 50 runs ashore were intercepted, according to the admiral in charge of the whole operation.
Excuse me, were all these boats out of 10 Pound Island?
Right.
10 Pound Island?
No, they were in East Gloucester. This original cutter station was over in East Gloucester. And there's a photo of them, which I also couldn't use. 17 of them lined up, ready to chase out the sea. But even so, they weren't all that effective. An awful lot was still getting in. So von Paulson also happened to be a pilot, and he was Coast Guard pilot number 6, one of the first Coast Guard pilots. And his idea was to set up an air station so he could fly out and spot rum boats and get the word back so that these cutters could run out and apprehend the rum boats. It seems like a perfectly natural idea today, but in 1925 at the time, the planes were still regarded as playthings for rich playboys, and there weren't any airlines. And in the Boston airport was one little building, and you had to go over a cinder road to get from Boston to get there. So it was early days, and it was a radical idea. And he couldn't get any money for it, but he got some permission to go ahead and try. So that's when 10 Pound Island came in, because it was a government compound at the time, because from 1820, the city had, at the town had ceded 10 Pound Island to the government for the Lighthouse. So they gave him the whole island. And that's why the fish hatchery was on government property. So he had a location, and he borrowed one plane from the Navy for a year, and he got an Army tent for for $1 from the Army as a hanger. And he got another pilot to fly with him, assigned to him. And he was so successful in the first year that the Coast Guard approved the idea and got appropriation from Congress for some more boats, some more planes. And then the operation really went into high gear.
Now, originally, these planes had some trouble being equipped to land on water.
Initially the Seaplanes design lagged behind land planes because of the problem of drag in the water, and they finally solved that with pontoons pretty well. But it was always kind of behind.
So I know you mentioned, I think they tried canoes.
Yeah,
they tried strapping on canoes, and
Yep.
that was a disaster. And they did other experiments, but the planes eventually that were out of Ten Pot Island were seaplanes.
They were seaplanes, right? There certainly wasn't room there for a runway, that's for sure.
No, yeah.
Now, another interesting thing was that, now we had his plane, the first one up in the air, but it didn't have any radio in it. So how was he going to contact his patrol boats at the base for them to run out and chase around? Pigeons. So he carried pigeons on board, and when it spot a rum boat and jot down the coordinates where it was, attach that to the pigeon's leg, and toss the pigeon out of the plane. The trick was to toss the pigeon far enough so it wasn't hit by the propeller. So that was communication at the
Right.
beginning.
So the idea that the planes were used as spotters.
Yes.
And to indicate to the ground personnel where a shipment was coming in.
Right. The second generation of planes were armed. They had machine guns. They never hit anybody. But one Gloucester rum runner who is very well known to past generations with Cigar Joe Frontiero.
There's a picture of Cigar Joe and his family in the book.
Right, yeah. And thanks to the late Fred Buck at the Cape Ann Museum, Fred got to me the transcript of Joe Frontiero's recollections of being a rum runner, and how he was pursued by these little planes, which were firing, but they never hit his boat. He was more concerned with the cannons off of bigger Coast Guard vessels, but he was happy to give up the trade.
Can you? I wonder if there's a passage or two that you like particularly and reflect your style, and also the content, which is often very surprising and kind of interesting, and maybe read a paragraph or two for us.
Yeah, be glad to try.
I should have warned you I was going to put you on the spot, but I forgot to mention that before we went on the air.
Let me see. Just that sort of at leisure, at random here, in the Gloucester of the Prohibition with the flapper era, there seemed to be dances everywhere, some sponsored by civic organizations, some with instructors. It was ballroom dancing, by and large. The incendiary word jazz did not appear on the notices. There was also evidence, or at least hearsay, that the quantities of liquor consumed at these supposedly decorous dances resulted in public disturbances. Alderman Martha Brooks relayed a constituent statement, uncorroborated, that 41 young women had been seen leaving a dance in an inebriated state. A representative of a farm organization commented that there was not nearly as much noise at one of his group's dances as when a nearby prayer meeting let out.
I've seen some of those prayer meetings under tents, and they can be loud.
Yes.
People, I think, in Gloucester today tend to think, I think we all do, that the situation was pretty much always the way it is now. We think our world, our immediate temporal atmosphere is what was. And of course, Gloucester was a pretty wild place, full of taverns. I mean, there were still 30 taverns in Gloucester just 30 years ago.
Sure.
And a lot more before that.
Right.
I think this book really, although I knew some of that, really kind of woke me up to the to the action that was going on during Prohibition in Gloucester. It was very active.
And there was this dichotomy, a social dichotomy of those on one side, and then the rather uptight people still carried the mores and attitudes of the 19th century, which conflicted strongly with it. There was that friction.
Yeah. We know where the friction wound up. We know who won finally.
Yeah.
I want to ask, viewers tell me they're always interested in some of the nuts and bolts. On this book, this is your fifth book, Chet. How long did this book take from conception to printing?
My books have been at 3-year intervals.
3 years.
So I guess I spent a year thrashing around, then a year in deep research, and then a year of throwing out drafts and starting again, and finally coming up with something I'm reasonably happy with.
How did you get the idea for 10 Pound Island and the Air Force?
Well, I'd heard something about airplanes that flying out of 10 Pound Island, and I guess constantly being down at the boulevard and over on Stagefort, seeing this island over there, and wondering whatever did happen to it, what the history was. Matter of fact, Auntie, my wife, and I were out there in a kayak once back a long time ago when it was just wild, and it's back to its wild state now. But I started wondering, what was it about the airplanes here? What was it about the fish hatchery and the lighthouse? How did that compare to the other lighthouses? So it was really just a curiosity about this island sitting out there that has never had much attention. So I thought it deserved some.
Well, I was very glad to see this, and for you to contact me. I had never heard that. I had never heard a whisper. I mean, some people around here must know about it. Certainly you do. I had never heard that there were planes out of 10 Pound Island, which is now, I think, a bird sanctuary?
It is. It is pretty much in its wild state. There was a movement a few years ago to increase visitor facilities out there. And that was met with howls of disapproval by particularly the folks on the Rocky Neck. And the general feeling seemed to be, and this goes also back to a couple of other times when this was tossed on the table, that people would rather have it just as it is, in its wild state.
And all that record, all the artifact record of the fisheries or the hatcheries and most of the foundation for the lighthouse, and certainly the Coast Guard's air station has disappeared.
Right. The fish hatchery buildings didn't disappear by themselves. The air station was cleared out completely. There's very little, if any, remains of that. But the fish hatchery buildings remained, and they were a nuisance. They were an eyesore. And when the city reacquired the island after from the Coast Guard, once the Coast Guard left the Lighthouse, closed down the Lighthouse, and the island reverted to Gloucester, then City Council had a great idea. And in 1964, a highlight of the 4th of July celebrations was a great bonfire burning up those buildings.
That satisfied that problem, or solved that problem.
Right.
I just noticed we're almost out of town. That's a good place to end it, though.
Good.
Burning down with a bonfire the old remnants of the fish hatchery.
Yeah.
Chet Brigham, I want to thank you very much for being on the Writer's Block. Again, you're a very prominent local historian and contributing valuable texts to our local heritage and our local tradition. I appreciate that. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
I want to thank our TV audience as well for being with us. If you've learned something about Chet Brigham's new book, 10-Pound Island, where the Coast Guard earned its wings, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.